Sometimes the heart knows things the mind cannot explain, and sometimes a dream can change everything. For 30 years, Eleanor Whitmore had lived with a loneliness that money could never fill, until the day a dusty cowboy appeared at her gate. He had ridden 300 miles, following a dream that showed him her face. The townspeople called him Crazy No Man, travels that far chasing visions. But when Eleanor heard his story through her window, she opened her door and said 5 words that shocked everyone. "I've been waiting for you." The whole town watched as she invited this stranger inside, not knowing their meeting would uncover secrets buried for decades. What could connect a wandering cowboy to the richest woman in Cedar Ridge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound dream journal slipped from Jack Sullivan's weathered hands as he stood in Eleanor Whitmore's parlor, pages fluttering open to reveal detailed sketches of this very room. He had drawn these furnishings, these wallpapers, even the way the afternoon light fell across the Persian Rugel, from dreams that had haunted him for months. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized the familiar handwriting in the margins, so much like her late father's careful script. The stranger before her possessed eyes the color of storm clouds and hands that spoke of honest work and hardship. His clothes bore the dust of long travel, yet he carried himself with quiet dignity that commanded respect. "Ma'am, I know this sounds like the ramblings of a man touched by sun," Jack said, retrieving his journal with reverence. "But these dreams started coming to me after my foreman work ended in Colorado. Night after night, I'd see this house, this room, and a woman with silver hair and eyes like morning mist." Eleanor moved to the window, overlooking Cedar Ridge's main street, where clusters of townspeople had gathered to discuss the extraordinary scene they'd witnessed. Mrs. Henderson from the general store pointed animatedly toward the Whitmore mansion, while Sheriff Morrison scratched his beard in contemplation. The sight of Eleanor actually inviting a stranger inside had set tongues wagging from the church steps to the saloon doors. "Dreams have power, Mr. Sullivan," Eleanor said softly, touching the faded wedding portrait on her mantelpiece. The photograph showed a much younger version of herself beside Thomas Whitmore, the railroad baron who had built this house as a monument to their love. 25 years had passed since consumption claimed him, leaving Eleanor as the wealthiest widow in 3 counties and the loneliest. The house seemed to breathe with memories. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows that had witnessed decades of dinner parties, business meetings, and quiet evenings by the fire. Eleanor's staff of 3 Mrs. Coulter, the housekeeper, young Timothy, the groundskeeper, and Sarah, the cook, moved through their duties with the practiced efficiency of those who had served the Whitmore family for years. Jack's presence filled the space with an energy that had been absent since Thomas's death. When he spoke, his voice carried the cadence of a man who chose his words carefully, who understood that silence often said more than speech. His travels had taken him from Texas cattle drives to Colorado mining towns, always searching for something he couldn't name until those dreams began. "I kept a record of every vision," Jack continued, offering the journal to Eleanor. "Started thinking I was losing my mind until the dreams became so vivid I could taste the coffee you brew in your kitchen, hear the grandfather clock chiming in your hallway." Eleanor accepted the journal with trembling fingers, feeling the worn leather that had absorbed years of Jack's hopes and wanderings. The pages revealed not just sketches of her home, but detailed drawings of her garden, her favorite reading chair, even the way she arranged flowers from her greenhouse. The attention to detail defied explanation. No stranger could possess such intimate knowledge of her private world. "The dreams weren't just about the house," Jack said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They showed me you, ma'am. Sitting alone at your dining table, walking through your garden at sunset, reading by the fireplace with that particular way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're deep in thought." A chill ran through Eleanor as she realized the accuracy of his observations. Those were indeed her habits, her private moments that no one could have witnessed. She found herself studying Jack's face more intently, searching for something she couldn't quite identify, familiarity that tugged at the edges of her memory. Timothy appeared in the doorway, his young face flushed from running. "Ma'am, Sheriff Morrison is requesting an audience. Says the whole town's concerned about." He glanced nervously at Jack. "About the situation." Eleanor straightened, remembering her position in Cedar Ridge society. The townspeople looked to her for stability, for the level-headed leadership that had guided them through economic hardships and natural disasters. Her reputation had been built on sound judgment and careful consideration, qualities that seemed to have abandoned her the moment she heard Jack's story. "Tell Sheriff Morrison I'll speak with him presently," Eleanor said, her voice regaining its authoritative tone. "But first, I'd like to show our guest to the library, where he can refresh himself properly." Mrs. Coulter, a stern woman in her 60s who had practically raised Eleanor after her mother's early death, appeared with the silent efficiency that made her invaluable. Her disapproving glance at Jack's dusty boots and worn clothing spoke volumes about her feelings regarding Eleanor's unprecedented hospitality. "Shall I prepare the guest quarters, ma'am?" Mrs. Coulter asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes, please. Mr. Sullivan has traveled far, and common decency demands we offer him proper rest and a hot meal." Jack held up a weathered hand. "Ma'am, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't want to impose or cause you trouble with your neighbors. A place in your stable would suit me fine." "Nonsense," Eleanor replied with surprising firmness. "Any man who carries dreams detailed enough to navigate 300 miles of wilderness deserves better than a stable. Besides, I suspect our conversation is far from over." The truth was, Eleanor felt more alive than she had in years. Jack's arrival had awakened something within her, that wealth and social position could never provide a sense that life still held mysteries worth exploring. His presence challenged the carefully ordered existence she had maintained since Thomas's death, when duty and propriety had become her primary companions. As they walked toward the library, Eleanor noticed how Jack moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. His boots, though worn, were well maintained, and his manner suggested education despite his working-class appearance. There was something about him that reminded her of her father, that same quiet strength and integrity that had built the Whitmore fortune through fair dealing and hard work. The library held Eleanor's most treasured possessions, first edition volumes, family papers, and the business records that documented her careful stewardship of the Whitmore legacy. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books that had provided her comfort during countless lonely evenings. "Your husband was a learned man," Jack observed, scanning the impressive collection. "Thomas believed knowledge was the greatest inheritance one could leave," Eleanor replied. "He spent hours in this room, planning the railroad expansion that connected Cedar Ridge to the outside world." Jack paused before a map of the Western Territories, studying the railway lines that Thomas had helped establish. "Takes vision to see opportunity where others see only wilderness. My father used to say that dreamers and builders share the same restless spirit." Eleanor felt another jolt of recognition at his words. Her father had expressed nearly identical sentiments when discussing business philosophy with Thomas during their courtship. The similarity seemed too striking to be mere coincidence. "Mr. Sullivan, may I ask about your family, your background before you became a cowboy?" Jack's expression grew distant, touched with sadness. "Lost my parents young, ma'am. Raised by an uncle who meant well but had little patience for a boy's questions. Left home at 16 to make my own way. Been moving ever since, following work and weather, until these dreams gave me a destination." Sheriff Morrison's voice echoed from the front hall, followed by Mrs. Coulter's diplomatic responses. Eleanor knew she couldn't delay the inevitable confrontation much longer. Cedar Ridge's citizens deserved an explanation for her unprecedented behavior, even if she didn't fully understand it herself. "The dreams," Jack said suddenly. "They didn't just show me your house and daily routines. They showed me your sadness, ma'am. The way you stand at your bedroom window each morning, watching the sunrise alone. The way you set two places at your dining table out of habit, then remove one with such careful dignity. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion, those private moments of grief witnessed by no one, somehow known to this stranger who claimed to have dreamed them. The impossibility of it defied rational explanation, yet his accuracy was undeniable. "What do you think it means, Mr. Sullivan, these dreams that brought you here?" Jack met her gaze directly, his storm-grey eyes reflecting a depth of feeling that stirred something long dormant in Eleanor's heart. "I think, ma'am, that sometimes the universe has plans that make sense only when we look back from where we end up. I think maybe we both been searching for something without knowing quite what it was." Outside, the sounds of Cedar Ridge's daily life continued: horses clopping down Main Street, children playing in front yards, merchants closing their shops as evening approached. But inside the Whitmore mansion, two souls who had wandered separate paths for decades sat in a library filled with wisdom and wonder, beginning to suspect that their meeting was no accident. Eleanor closed Jack's dream journal and placed it carefully on Thomas's old desk. Whatever forces had brought this remarkable man to her door, she intended to understand them fully. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 25 years seemed to lift slightly, replaced by curiosity and something that felt remarkably like hope. Sheriff Morrison's weathered face bore the expression of a man caught between duty and diplomacy as he settled into Eleanor's parlor chair. Behind him stood three prominent townsmen, Mayor Hutchins, Reverend Walsh, and Dr. Brennan, each wearing varying degrees of concern and curiosity. "Eleanor, we've known each other since you were knee-high to a grasshopper," Sheriff Morrison began, his tone carefully respectful. "Your judgment has guided this town through tough times, which is why folks are puzzled by today's events." Jack stood near the fireplace, his dream journal tucked securely under his arm. He had insisted on facing the townspeople directly, rather than hiding in the guest quarters, a decision that earned Eleanor's quiet approval. "Sheriff, I appreciate the town's concern," Eleanor replied, "but I fail to see how offering hospitality to a weary traveler warrants a delegation." Dr. Brennan, a scholarly man in his 50s, stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, with respect, this isn't merely about hospitality. The man claims supernatural visions led him here. In my medical opinion, such delusions often indicate serious mental disturbance." "Begging your pardon, Doc," Jack interjected, his voice calm but firm. "But there's nothing delusional about what I experienced. I've got evidence of every dream, recorded, detailed, and dated." He opened his journal to a specific page, revealing a meticulously drawn sketch of Eleanor's rose garden, complete with the unique arrangement she had planted in memory of her late mother. The drawing included details that could only be observed from inside the garden's private borders: the small stone bench beneath the climbing roses, the way the morning light filtered through the arbor, even the specific varieties of flowers she favored. Mayor Hutchins examined the sketch with growing amazement. "This is remarkably accurate, Mr. Sullivan. I've attended garden parties here for 20 years, and you've captured details I never noticed." "The dreams didn't just show me places," Jack continued, turning to another page. "They showed me moments, personal moments that no stranger should know." The new sketch depicted Eleanor in her library, reading by lamplight with her late husband's favorite book in her Lapa ritual she performed every year on the anniversary of Thomas's death. The drawing captured not just her posture and surroundings, but the profound sadness that marked those private observances. Eleanor felt her composure crack slightly. That particular evening ritual was something she had never shared with anyone, not even Mrs. Coulter. The accuracy of Jack's vision touched something deep within her, a place where grief and hope intermingled in ways she had never fully understood. "There's more," Jack said softly, reaching into his vest pocket. "Something I've carried for years without understanding why." He produced a small silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful in its craftsmanship. Eleanor gasped audibly as recognition hit her like a physical blow. The locket was identical to one she had lost decades ago, family heirloom that had belonged to her grandmother, her mother, and then to her during her first marriage. "Where did you get that?" Eleanor whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her throat where the locket had once rested. Found it as a boy, caught in tree roots after a flash flood near my uncle's place in Wyoming. Something about it called to me, so I kept it close. Never knew why until I started having the dreams and realized the woman in my visions wore one just like it. Sheriff Morrison leaned forward intently. Eleanor, is that the locket you lost when I was 18? Eleanor finished, her voice barely audible. I lost it during my first marriage. Before I met Thomas, I always assumed it was gone forever. The silence in the room grew heavy as the implications settled over everyone present. Reverend Walsh, a man who had dedicated his life to matters of faith and mystery, spoke carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, if I may ask, what exactly happened during your first marriage? You've never spoken of it in all the years I've served this community. Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the town she had called home for most of her adult life. The memories she had buried for 30 years pressed against her consciousness like floodwater against a failing dam. I was very young, she began slowly. 17 when I married Daniel Morrison, Sheriff, Morrison's cousin, actually. We were barely children ourselves, swept up in romance and dreams of building a life together. Sheriff Morrison's eyes widened with understanding. I remember Daniel mentioning his young bride before he headed west. But we lost contact after he left for the gold fields in California. Daniel was determined to make his fortune in the mining camps, Eleanor continued, her reflection ghost-like in the window glass. He promised to send for me once he established himself, but months passed without word. Then came the telegram saying he had died in a mining accident near Sacramento. Jack's hands tightened around his locket, an unconscious gesture that didn't escape Eleanor's notice. Ma'am, what year was that? 1855. I was barely 19 when I became a widow for the first time. My father insisted I return to Cedar Ridge to heal, and eventually I met Thomas through his railroad business connections. Dr. Brennan cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Whitmore, forgive my directness, but did you ever receive confirmation of your first husband's death beyond that initial telegram? Eleanor turned from the window, her composure finally cracking under the weight of memories and implications. No, I never did. My father said it was best to leave the past buried and focus on building a future with Thomas. I was young enough to believe that forgetting was the same as healing. Jack stepped closer, his presence both comforting and unsettling. Ma'am, I don't want to cause you pain, but I need to ask, did your first husband have any distinguishing features? Anything that might help identify him? Daniel had a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, Eleanor said slowly, and the most unusual eyes grey like storm clouds, with little flecks of blue that seemed to change with his moods. The description hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every person in the room could see that Jack possessed those exact same distinctive eyes, the same colouring that Eleanor had just described. The physical resemblance was unmistakable once pointed out. Mayor Hutchins spoke what everyone was thinking. Mr. Sullivan, your eyes match that description perfectly. Jack's voice was rough with emotion. Ma'am, I need to tell you something about my background that I've never shared with anyone. My uncle who raised me wasn't my father's brother, he was my mother's, and my mother died giving birth to me in a mining camp outside Sacramento in 1856. The mathematical implications struck everyone simultaneously. If Jack was born in 1856 and his father had died in the mining camps, the timeline aligned perfectly with Daniel Morrison's disappearance and presumed death. Eleanor sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the convergence of facts that seemed impossible yet undeniably connected. What was your mother's name? Mary Sullivan. But my uncle said she sometimes went by other names, depending on circumstances. He was never clear about her past before I was born. Sheriff Morrison removed his hat, running his hand through graying hair. Daniel's last letter mentioned he was keeping company with a young woman in the camps. Never mentioned her name, but he seemed quite taken with her. The pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle were falling into place with devastating clarity. Eleanor found herself staring at Jack with new eyes, searching his features for traces of the young man she had loved and lost so many years ago. The jawline, the way he held his shoulders, even his manner of speaking, subtle similarities that became obvious once she knew what to look for. "The dreams," Jack said softly, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "They weren't just random visions, they were memories, inherited memories of places and feelings connected to my father." Dr. Brennan, ever the man of science, struggled with the metaphysical implications. "While I cannot explain the mechanism, there are documented cases of children possessing knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means, perhaps some form of genetic memory or psychic inheritance." Reverend Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Scripture speaks of the sins of the fathers being visited upon the children, but perhaps blessings and connections can be inherited as well. The Lord works in mysterious ways." Eleanor stood on unsteady legs, moving closer to Jack until she could study his features in the fading daylight. The resemblance to Daniel was subtle but undeniable: the shape of his nose, the set of his mouth when he was deep in thought, the way his hair curled slightly at the temples. "Jack," she said, testing how his name felt on her lips. "Jack Morrison Sullivan. You're Daniel's Sonmi stepson, if such relationships survive death and time." The acknowledgement hit both of them with unexpected force. Jack had spent his entire adult life searching for belonging, following dreams he couldn't understand toward a destination he couldn't name. Eleanor had spent 30 years believing her first love was completely lost, never imagining that a piece of him had survived and would eventually find its way back to her. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well, this certainly puts a different light on recent events. Mrs. Whitmore, the town owes you an apology for questioning your judgment." "No apology necessary," Eleanor replied, her voice gaining strength. "But I would appreciate privacy to process these revelations. Jack and I have much to discuss." As the delegation prepared to leave, Sheriff Morrison paused at the door. "Eleanor, Daniel was a good man who loved you deeply. If his son carries even a portion of his father's character, you've been blessed with an extraordinary reunion." After the townspeople departed, Eleanor and Jack sat in the gathering dusk, two souls connected by bonds they were only beginning to understand. The silver locket lay on the table between them, a tangible link to a past that had suddenly become their shared present. "I've been dreaming of my father's love for you," Jack said quietly. "That's what the visions were, his memories of this house, his feelings for the woman who lived here, passed down to me through blood and longing." Eleanor picked up the locket, feeling its familiar weight after so many years. "And I've been waiting for something I couldn't name, never realizing I was waiting for the return of love in a form I never expected." The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty. They had found each other through the persistence of love that transcended death, time, and understanding, a connection that would reshape both their lives in ways they were only beginning to imagine. The morning sun painted golden rectangles across Eleanor's dining room floor as she and Jack shared their first breakfast together. The formal dining table, which had hosted only Eleanor's solitary meals for decades, now accommodated two-place settings that felt surprisingly natural. Mrs. Knight, Coulter had overcome her initial skepticism about their house guest, though she continued to observe Jack with the protective vigilance of a woman who had devoted her life to Eleanor's welfare. "The land deed documents are in Thomas's study," Eleanor said, buttering her toast with careful precision. "Though I confess I haven't reviewed them thoroughly in recent years. Thomas handled most legal matters during our marriage." Jack accepted a second cup of coffee, appreciating the domestic comfort he had never experienced during his wandering years. "Ma'am, if you don't mind my asking, why the concern about property documents now?" Eleanor's expression grew troubled. "My nephew Marcus has been pressuring me to sell portions of the estate. He claims the property taxes and maintenance costs are becoming excessive for a woman of my age to manage alone." "And you disagree?" "Thomas left me well, provided for," Eleanor replied firmly. "The estate generates sufficient income from our tenant farms and timber rights. Marcus's concerns seem more related to his own financial interests than mine." Mrs. Coulter entered with fresh biscuits, her timing convenient enough to suggest she had been listening from the kitchen doorway. If I may speak plainly, ma'am, young Mr. Friend, Marcus has been asking pointed questions about property values and inheritance laws, makes a body wonder about his intentions. Jack's military bearing became more pronounced at the mention of potential family conflict. Years of managing ranch operations had taught him to recognize when financial pressure masked deeper problems. How long has this been going on? Marcus began his campaign shortly after his father-me brother-in-law passed away last spring. Eleanor explained. He inherited substantial debts along with his father's business, and I suspect he views my estate as a solution to his financial difficulties. The conversation was interrupted by Timothy's arrival at the dining room doorway, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Ma'am, there's a group of men at the front gate requesting an audience. They're dressed like business folks from back east, and they're asking specifically about property boundaries. Eleanor and Jack exchanged concerned glances. Did they mention Marcus? Yes, ma'am, said he arranged the meeting to discuss development opportunities. Jack rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a man accustomed to responding quickly to potential threats. Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to observe this meeting. In my experience, surprise business meetings rarely favor the property owner. Eleanor felt grateful for Jack's supportive presence, a sentiment that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I would appreciate your perspective, Jack. You've managed large operations and understand how business can mask personal agendas. They moved to the front parlor, where Eleanor could observe the visitors through her lace curtains. 3 well-dressed men stood near the gate, examining surveying equipment and consulting detailed maps. Their professional appearance and expensive clothing marked them as serious investors with substantial resources. Eastern developers, Jack observed, his tone carrying the wariness of someone who had witnessed corporate interests clash with individual property rights. The kind who see land as numbers on a ledger rather than homes and heritage. Marcus Whitmore approached the gate from Main Street, his clothing and demeanor reflecting his efforts to project success despite his known financial troubles. Eleanor's nephew possessed the kind of superficial charm that could convince people to trust him until they discovered his true motivations. Eleanor, darling, Marcus called out as he spotted her in the window. I've brought some gentlemen who are interested in discussing mutually beneficial arrangements regarding the estate. Eleanor opened the front door but remained on her covered porch, using the elevated position to maintain psychological advantage. Marcus, you should have requested permission before bringing strangers to my home. These are legitimate businessmen, Aunt Eleanor, representatives from the Colorado Development Company who specialize in transforming underutilized properties into profitable enterprises. Jack stepped into view beside Eleanor, his presence immediately noticed by the visitors. Marcus's expression shifted to poorly concealed irritation at the sight of the stranger who had complicated his carefully laid plans. And who might this be? Marcus asked, his tone suggesting Jack's presence was both unexpected and unwelcome. This is Jack Sullivan, Eleanor replied calmly. A family friend who is staying as my guest. The lead developer, a distinguished man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit, approached the porch with calculated friendliness. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Charles Pemberton from the Colorado Development Company. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your property that would eliminate all your financial concerns. I have no financial concerns, Mr. Pemberton, Eleanor responded coolly. My estate is profitable and well managed. Pemberton glanced at Marcus, clearly having been told a different story. Perhaps we could discuss the details in private. Real estate transactions often involve complex considerations that benefit from professional guidance. Jack's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a change that Eleanor recognized as protective alertness. Ma'am, in my experience, any business proposal that requires immediate privacy usually benefits the buyers more than the sellers. Marcus's facade began to crack under the pressure of Jack's interference. Aunt Eleanor, surely you don't intend to base important decisions on the advice of a drifting cowboy you met yesterday. I intend to base my decisions on careful consideration and sound judgment, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the authority that had made her a respected figure in Cedar Ridge society. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your interest, but I am not currently considering selling any portion of my estate." Pemberton's professional smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened with the determination of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps you're not fully aware of the financial pressures facing large estate owners in this changing economy. Property taxes are increasing, maintenance costs are rising, and without proper management, even substantial wealth can disappear quickly." The subtle threat in his words was not lost on Eleanor or Jack. This was not merely a business proposition, but a campaign of pressure designed to force her hand. "My property taxes are current, my maintenance is excellent, and my management is sound," Eleanor stated firmly. "Unless you have legitimate business to discuss, I must ask you to leave my property." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "Aunt Eleanor, you're being unreasonable. These gentlemen have traveled considerable distance to make you a fair offer. The least you could do is listen to their proposal." Jack moved slightly closer to Eleanor, his presence communicating support without being overtly threatening. "The lady has given her answer, Marcus. Seems to me a gentleman would respect that." "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Marcus snapped. "This is family business involving family property." "Actually," Eleanor interjected, "Jack is family. His father was my first husband, making Jack my stepson and giving him more legitimate interest in my welfare than your financial schemes provide you." The revelation clearly shocked Marcus, who had built his plans around Eleanor's isolation and lack of family support. Pemberton's expression also shifted as he recalculated the situation facing a property owner with family backing rather than a vulnerable widow. "We'll be staying at the Cedar Ridge Hotel if you reconsider," Pemberton said, signaling his associates to begin packing their surveying equipment. "But I should mention that development opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely. Market conditions change, and today's generous offer might not be tomorrow's reality." After the group departed, Eleanor and Jack remained on the porch, processing the implications of the encounter. The threat had been delivered politely but unmistakably sell now, on their terms, or face increasingly difficult pressure in the future. "They'll be back," Jack said quietly. "Men like that don't accept rejection easily, especially when they've invested time and money in preliminary planning." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with defending not just her own interests, but the legacy Thomas had entrusted to her care. "Jack, I know you came here following dreams rather than seeking involvement in family conflicts. I understand if you prefer to continue your travels rather than become entangled in my difficulties." Jack turned to face her directly, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the same determination that had carried him 300 miles to find her. "Ma'am, I've spent 30 years searching for something I couldn't name. Now I've found family, purpose, and a place where I'm needed. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay and help protect what my father would have wanted preserved." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sunshine. For the first time in decades, she wasn't facing life's challenges alone. The son of her first love had arrived not just to reconnect with the past, but to help secure their future. "I would be honored to have your help, Jack. Together, we'll make sure Thomas's legacy and your father's memory are protected from those who see only profit where we see home." As they walked back into the house, both understood that their bond extended beyond shared history. They were allies now, united by family ties and common purpose against forces that threatened everything they had come to value. The real battle for Eleanor's independence was just beginning. The brass military medal caught the lamplight as Eleanor examined it in Thomas's study, turning the weathered decoration over in her hands with growing amazement. Jack had reluctantly produced the Medal of Honor from his leather saddlebag after she noticed his unconscious military bearing and precise way of organizing his belongings. "Company Commander, 2nd Colorado Volunteer Infantry," Eleanor read from the accompanying citation. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty during the Battle of Glorieta Pass, March 1000, 862. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly preferring to keep his military service private. Ancient history, ma'am, young man's war that taught me more about loss than glory. Jack, you were barely 21 when you earned this honor, Eleanor said, calculating the dates. And you've never mentioned your Civil War service to anyone in town? Don't see the point in dwelling on old battles. Besides, folks have their own opinions about that war, and I learned long ago that some stories are better left untold. Eleanor understood his reluctance. The Civil War had divided communities and families in ways that still resonated 20 years later. But Jack's military leadership experience explained his natural authority and the way he had assessed the threat posed by Marcus and the developers. This medal represents the highest honor our nation can bestow, Eleanor continued. The fact that you've carried it privately all these years speaks to your character more than any public recognition could. Mrs. Coulter knocked softly before entering with afternoon tea, her expression more approving than it had been since Jack's arrival. Word of his military service had spread through the household staff, earning him a measure of respect that his mysterious origins alone could not have achieved. Timothy's been asking about Mr. Sullivan's war stories, Mrs. Coulter reported as she arranged the tea service. The boy's always been fascinated by tales of soldiering, though his mother worries such interests will give him wandering ideas. Jack accepted his teacup with a slight smile. Timothy strikes me as a young man who thinks before he acts. That's worth more than any war story could teach him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window, where Marcus could be seen riding up the drive with uncharacteristic urgency. His previous day's defeat had apparently not discouraged his determination to pressure Eleanor into reconsidering the developer's offer. He's brought documents, Eleanor observed, noting the leather portfolio secured to Marcus's saddle. And he looks more determined than defeated. Jack rose and moved to a position where he could observe the conversation while remaining out of direct sight. His military training had taught him the value of intelligence gathering before confronting an opponent directly. Marcus dismounted and approached the front door with the confident stride of a man who believed he held winning cards. Mrs. Coulter answered his knock with cool professionalism, neither welcoming nor rejecting his presence. "Aunt Eleanor, I need to speak with you privately about urgent family matters," Marcus announced as he entered the parlor. "Legal matters that affect the entire estate." Eleanor remained seated, using her position to maintain psychological control of the meeting. "Marcus, any family matters can be discussed openly. Jack is family after all." Marcus's jaw tightened at the reminder of Jack's legitimate connection to Eleanor. "Very well. I've discovered some concerning information about the estate's financial situation that requires immediate attention." He opened his portfolio and produced several official-looking documents, spreading them across Eleanor's coffee table with theatrical gravity. "These are property tax assessments for the coming year. The county has substantially increased valuations based on development potential, which means your tax burden will triple." Eleanor examined the documents carefully, noting the official seals and legal language that appeared authentic. "When did you obtain these assessments, Marcus?" "The county clerk is a friend of mine. He gave me advance notice as a courtesy to the family." Marcus's tone suggested he expected gratitude for his supposed helpfulness. "As you can see, the increased taxes will consume most of your annual income. Selling to the developers becomes not just profitable but necessary." Jack stepped into view, his presence immediately shifting the room's dynamic. "Marcus, those documents look remarkably convenient in their timing. Almost as if someone knew exactly what financial pressure points to target." "Are you suggesting I fabricated official county documents?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising with indignation that seemed slightly forced. "I'm suggesting that convenient timing often masks convenient arrangements." Jack replied calmly. "In my experience, when someone benefits significantly from creating a problem, it's worth questioning whether the problem is as real as it appears." Eleanor studied the tax assessments more carefully, her business acumen sharpened by years of managing Thomas's legacy. "Marcus, These valuations are based on theoretical development potential rather than current use. Such assessments typically require formal hearings and appeals processes. The appeal period has passed, Marcus replied quickly. These are final assessments that take effect immediately. Jack moved closer to examine the documents, his military training evident in his systematic approach. Ma'am, notice the dates on these papers. They're all from this week, yet Marcus claims the appeal period has passed. That suggests either an impossibly short notification period or documents prepared after the fact. Marcus's composure began to crack under Jack's methodical questioning. You have no legal standing to challenge these documents, Sullivan. This is between family members who understand business realities. Actually, Eleanor interjected, her voice carrying the authority that had made her a force in Cedar Ridge society. Jack's military leadership experience gives him exactly the kind of strategic perspective I value, and his questions about timing and procedure are entirely valid. She stood and walked to Thomas's desk, retrieving a leather-bound ledger that contained detailed records of all estate expenses and revenues. Marcus, according to my records, the estate generated substantial profits last year, even after all taxes and maintenance costs. These new assessments would indeed create financial pressure, but not the crisis you're suggesting. Marcus realized his strategy was failing and shifted to more direct pressure tactics. Aunt Eleanor, you're being naive about the changing economics of large estate ownership. The developer's offer represents financial security that independent management cannot guarantee. What I see, Eleanor replied firmly, is manufactured urgency designed to pressure me into decisions that benefit you more than me. The developer's offer may be generous, but it's also irreversible. Once this land is sold, the legacy Thomas built cannot be recovered. Jack recognized the moment when diplomatic persuasion gave way to underlying threats. Marcus's expression hardened with the frustration of a man whose carefully laid plans were unraveling. Aunt Eleanor, you're making a serious mistake by trusting a stranger over family advice. When financial difficulties become overwhelming, don't expect me to provide assistance that you're rejecting now. The implicit threat was clear: comply with his wishes or face future troubles without family support. Eleanor felt her anger rise at the manipulation disguised as concern. Marcus, I believe this conversation has run its course. I will consult with my attorney about these tax assessments and make my own decisions about their validity. After Marcus departed with obvious frustration, Eleanor and Jack remained in the study, processing the encounter's implications. The pressure campaign was escalating from financial manipulation to personal intimidation. He'll be back with different tactics, Jack observed. Men like Marcus don't accept defeat gracefully, especially when money is involved. Eleanor nodded, feeling grateful for Jack's steady presence. I've dealt with business pressure before, but never from family members who should be offering support rather than creating problems. Ma'am, if you don't mind my saying so, you handled that conversation with exactly the kind of strength my father would have admired. Standing firm against pressure takes courage, especially when it comes from people who claim to have your best interests at heart. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest at Jack's words. The validation meant more coming from Daniel's son than from any business associate or community leader. Their bond was deepening beyond shared history into genuine mutual respect and affection. Jack, I've been thinking about your father's dreams that led you here. Perhaps they weren't just about reconnecting us, but about ensuring someone would be here when I needed protection and support. Jack's storm-grey eyes reflected the same thought. I spent 30 years feeling like I was searching for something I couldn't name. Now I understand I was meant to find you when you needed family most. As evening settled over Cedar Ridge, Eleanor and Jack sat in comfortable companionship, planning their response to Marcus's pressure campaign. The estate documents needed careful review, the tax assessments required legal verification, and the developer's true intentions needed investigation. But beneath the practical concerns lay a deeper truth. Two people who had lived with loneliness and uncertainty had found each other at precisely the right moment. Eleanor's wealth and social position provided resources, while Jack's military experience and strategic thinking offered protection. Together, they formed a partnership that could withstand whatever challenges Marcus and his allies might devise. Tomorrow, we'll visit the county courthouse and examine those tax records personally, Eleanor decided. If Marcus is manipulating official documents, we need proof before he can cause further damage. Jack nodded agreement, already planning their approach with the thoroughness that had served him well during his military career. And I'll pay a visit to the hotel where those developers are staying. Sometimes listening to private conversations reveals more than formal meetings. Eleanor smiled at his tactical thinking. My dear Jack, I believe your father's spirit guided you here not just to heal old wounds, but to help fight new battles. Together, we'll protect what Thomas built and honor what Daniel dreamed. The future remained uncertain, but neither Eleanor nor Jack faced it alone anymore. They had found family, purpose, and the strength that comes from shared determination to protect what matters most. The hidden letter trembled in Eleanor's hands as she read her late husband's familiar handwriting, words that shattered 30 years of cherished memories. Thomas's private correspondence, discovered behind a loose board in his study desk, revealed truths that transformed her understanding of their marriage and her first husband's fate. My dearest Eleanor, the letter began, if you are reading this, then God has finally called me home, and you have discovered what I prayed you would never need to know. I have lived with this burden for 25 years, and I can carry it no longer without leaving you some explanation. Jack stood near the study window, giving Eleanor privacy to process Thomas's posthumous confession while remaining close enough to offer support. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room where so many family decisions had been made, now hosting the revelation that would change everything. Daniel Morrison did not die in a mining accident as we led you to believe. Eleanor read aloud, her voice growing steadier with each shocking word. Your first husband was murdered by claim jumpers who wanted his stake in the Lucky Strike mine. He fought bravely, but was outnumbered and betrayed by men he trusted as partners. The letter continued with details that painted a picture of violence and greed in the California goldfields, where Daniel's success had attracted the wrong kind of attention. Thomas had been present as a railroad surveyor when Daniel's body was discovered, and he had personally sent the telegram to Eleanor reporting the supposed accident. I convinced myself that telling you the truth would only increase your pain, Thomas's letter explained. A mining accident seemed kinder than murder, and I believed you would heal more easily from tragedy than from injustice. But my decision to protect you from the truth became the foundation of our life together, and I fear it has poisoned what should have been pure. Eleanor set the letter down with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the implications of Thomas's well-intentioned deception. Everything she had believed about her first marriage's end, her grieving process, and the beginning of her relationship with Thomas now required re-examination. There's more, she said quietly, picking up additional pages. Thomas wrote about Daniel's final days, about his plans to return to Cedar Ridge, about the child he never knew existed. Jack turned from the window, his expression reflecting the emotional weight of learning about his father's violent death. Ma'am, you don't have to read this aloud if it's too painful. No, Jack. You deserve to know the truth about your father's fate, just as I need to understand what Thomas carried all these years. Eleanor's voice gained strength from her determination to honor both men's memories properly. The letter revealed that Daniel had struck a rich vein in his mine and was preparing to return to Eleanor with enough wealth to provide for their future. He had spoken constantly about his young wife back in Colorado, planning elaborate homecoming surprises and dreaming of the family they would build together. Daniel never knew about your mother, Mary, or your birth, Eleanor continued reading. But Thomas learned from other miners that Daniel had been faithful to his marriage vows, despite the temptations and loneliness of camp life. His relationship with your mother began only after he received a forged letter claiming I had died in a cholera outbreak. The complexity of deception and miscommunication that had shaped 3 lives became clearer with each paragraph. Daniel had mourned Eleanor based on false information, just as she had mourned him based on incomplete truth. Their love had been destroyed not by choice or change of heart, but by the deliberate actions of people who profited from chaos and confusion. Jack moved closer as Eleanor struggled with the emotional weight of these revelations. Thomas was trying to protect you in the only way he knew how. Given the violence of your husband's actual death, maybe his decision made sense at the time. Perhaps, Eleanor replied, but the deception became the cornerstone of our marriage. Every time I mourned Daniel or wondered about his final days, Thomas knew the truth and chose silence over honesty. The letter's final pages contained Thomas's confession about his growing love for Eleanor and his guilt about building their relationship on the foundation of his concealed knowledge. He had genuinely loved her but never felt worthy of her trust because of the secret he carried. I pray you can forgive an old man's fear of losing you to the truth, Thomas wrote in conclusion. You deserved honesty from the beginning, and my failure to provide it has been my greatest regret. If Daniel's son ever comes seeking information about his father, please tell him that Daniel Morrison died defending what was rightfully his, fighting men who respected neither law nor decency. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, feeling as though she were closing one chapter of her life while opening another. The man she had grieved for 30 years had been even more honorable than she remembered, while the man she had loved for 25 years had been more complex and flawed than she realized. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window, where Marcus could be seen approaching the house with Pemberton and 2 additional men who appeared more like hired muscle than legitimate businessmen. Their aggressive posture and coordinated approach suggested escalation from financial pressure to physical intimidation. They're not giving up, Jack observed, his military instincts immediately assessing the threat level. 4 men arriving together suggest they're prepared for resistance. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the knowledge that both Daniel and Thomas had faced difficult choices with courage. Then they'll discover that I'm prepared to provide it. This estate represents not just my security, but the legacy of 2 good men who deserved better than to have their memories dishonored by greed. Mrs. Coulter appeared in the doorway, her expression reflecting both concern and determination. Ma'am, those men are demanding immediate audience and threatening to involve legal authorities if refused. Should I send Timothy for Sheriff Morrison? Not yet, Eleanor replied, but have Timothy remain close in case we need him to ride for help quickly. Jack checked his pocket watch, noting the early hour of the confrontation. They're trying to catch us off guard, probably hoping you'll be more cooperative before you've had time to think through your options. As they prepared to face Marcus's latest pressure campaign, Eleanor felt a clarity she hadn't experienced since receiving Thomas's letter. The secrets and deceptions that had shaped her past were finally exposed, freeing her to face the future with complete honesty about what she was fighting to preserve. Jack, whatever happens next, I want you to know that finding you has been worth every difficulty it might bring. Your father would be proud of the man you've become, and Thomas would approve of the ally you've proven to be. Jack's storm-grey eyes reflected the same determination that had carried him through Civil War battles and 30 years of searching. Ma'am, we'll face whatever comes together. That's what family does. The sound of boots on the front porch announced the arrival of their opponents, but Eleanor and Jack stood ready to defend not just property and legal rights, but the honor of 2 men whose love had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The real battle for Eleanor's independence was about to begin, but she no longer faced it as an isolated widow, vulnerable to manipulation. She had family, truth, and purpose weapons, more powerful than Marcus could possibly comprehend. The railroad survey map spread across Eleanor's dining table revealed the devastating scope of Marcus and Pemberton's true intentions. Red lines marked proposed rail corridors that would slice directly through Cedar Ridge's heart, requiring the destruction of the church, the school, and most of Main Street's historic buildings. Jack traced the proposed route with his finger, his military experience allowing him to quickly understand the strategic implications. This isn't just about your estate, ma'am. They're planning to remake the entire town according to their vision of progress. Eleanor studied the detailed markings that showed her property as the key piece in a much larger development puzzle. The Whitmore estate's central location and extensive acreage made it essential for the railroad company's ambitious plans to transform Cedar Ridge from a quiet western town into a major transportation hub. "Look at these notations," Eleanor said, pointing to small print along the map's margins. "They've already secured options on 12 other properties, all contingent on acquiring our land as the primary depot site." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its ambition and ruthless in its execution. Marcus hadn't simply been pressuring one relative to sell inherited property. He had been orchestrating a coordinated campaign to reshape an entire community for corporate profit. Mrs. Coulter entered with coffee and the day's mail, her expression troubled. "Ma'am, there are letters from 3 of our tenant farmers. They're all reporting visits from well-dressed men, asking questions about lease terms and renewal dates." Eleanor opened the first letter from Ben Hartwell, who had farmed 40 acres of Whitmore land for 15 years. His usually neat handwriting showed the shakiness of stress as he described pressure tactics designed to encourage lease abandonment. "They told me railroad development would eliminate agricultural use of the land," Eleanor read aloud. "Suggested I might want to find new arrangements before being forced out by eminent domain proceedings." Jack's expression darkened with anger at the systematic intimidation campaign. "They're trying to isolate you by eliminating your support network. Cut off your income sources, pressure your tenants to leave, and create the impression that resistance is futile." The second letter came from Margaret Prescott, whose family had operated the estate's sawmill for 2 generations. Her account described similar pressure tactics combined with offers to buy out her equipment at below-market prices if she agreed to relocate immediately. "This is more than business pressure," Eleanor observed. "This is a coordinated attack on everything Thomas built and everything I've worked to preserve." Timothy burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed from hard riding. "Ma'am, I've got urgent news from town. Sheriff Morrison sent me to warn you that Marcus has filed legal papers claiming you're mentally incompetent to manage the estate." The shocking escalation from financial pressure to legal challenges left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Marcus had moved beyond manipulation to direct assault on her autonomy and dignity. Jack's military bearing became pronounced as he processed the implications of Marcus's latest strategy. "He's trying to establish legal grounds for taking control of your property decisions. If he can convince a judge that you're not competent, he could be appointed as your guardian with authority to sell the estate." Eleanor felt her anger crystallize into determined resistance. Marcus had crossed the line from family disagreement to personal attack, using her age and gender as weapons against her independence. "Timothy, ride back to town and request that Sheriff Morrison come here immediately," Eleanor instructed. "Also ask him to bring Mayor Hutchins and Dr. Brennan. I want witnesses to my complete mental competency." As Timothy departed on his urgent errand, Eleanor and Jack began planning their defense against Marcus's legal strategy. The competency challenge would require careful documentation of Eleanor's sound judgment and clear thinking. "Ma'am, we need to gather evidence of your business acumen and decision-making ability," Jack suggested. "Financial records, correspondence with attorneys, documentation of successful estate management over the past 25 years. Eleanor moved to Thomas's desk and began pulling ledgers and files that demonstrated her careful stewardship of the family legacy. The records showed consistent profitability, wise investments, and prudent management that had actually increased the estate's value during her widowhood. "Here's correspondence with the territorial legislature about tax policy," Eleanor said, producing letters that showed her involvement in complex political and economic issues. "And these are records of my charitable contributions and community leadership activities." The evidence painted a picture of a woman fully engaged with community affairs and business management, hardly the portrait of someone suffering from mental incompetence. Marcus's strategy would require perjured testimony or corrupt judicial proceedings to succeed. Dr. Brennan arrived first, his medical bag suggesting he was prepared to provide professional assessment of Eleanor's mental state. Sheriff Morrison followed closely, accompanied by Mayor Hutchins and Reverend Walsh, all wearing expressions of concern and indignation. "Eleanor, this is outrageous," Dr. Brennan declared after reviewing the legal papers Timothy had brought. "I've been your physician for 15 years, and you're as mentally sharp as anyone in this territory." Sheriff Morrison's weathered face showed the anger of a man who had watched Marcus's schemes with growing suspicion. "Ma'am, I've known you since you were a girl, and your judgment has guided this town through more difficulties than I can count. Any lawyer who tries to claim incompetence will have to explain why you've been consulted on every major community decision for decades." Mayor Hutchins produced a folder of correspondence that demonstrated Eleanor's ongoing involvement in municipal affairs. "These letters show your participation in planning the new school, organizing disaster relief after last year's flooding, and mediating disputes between ranchers and farmers. No incompetent person could handle such complex community issues." Jack observed the gathering support with satisfaction, recognizing that Marcus had underestimated Eleanor's standing in the community. The competency challenge would fail because too many people had personal experience with Eleanor's wisdom and capability. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your support," Eleanor said, "but I suspect Marcus's legal strategy is intended more to create doubt and delay than to succeed in court. Every day spent fighting competency challenges is another day the estate remains vulnerable to other pressures." Reverend Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes legal proceedings are weapons of harassment rather than justice. The process itself becomes punishment, regardless of the outcome." The sound of approaching riders drew everyone's attention to the window, where Marcus could be seen leading a group that included Pemberton, 2 men who appeared to be lawyers, and several rough-looking individuals who seemed more suited to barroom brawls than legal proceedings. "He's escalating again," Jack observed, counting the approaching riders. 8 men suggests he's prepared for physical confrontation if legal pressure fails. Eleanor felt her resolve strengthen in the face of mounting threats. Marcus's increasingly desperate tactics revealed the weakness of his position and the strength of what she was defending. "Gentlemen, you're about to witness why I refuse to surrender my independence to men who mistake aggression for authority," Eleanor announced. "My estate, my community, and my dignity are worth defending against any pressure they can devise." As Marcus's group dismounted outside, Eleanor and her supporters prepared for what might be the decisive confrontation in the battle for her freedom. The stakes had escalated beyond property and money to fundamental questions of community values and individual rights. Jack positioned himself where he could respond to threats while remaining supportive rather than confrontational. His military experience had taught him when to fight and when to let others lead, and this battle belonged primarily to Eleanor and her community allies. The door knocker sounded with unusual force, announcing Marcus's arrival with his expanded team of pressure agents. But Eleanor no longer faced them alone or unprepared. She had family, friends, evidence, and the righteous anger of a woman whose patience with manipulation had finally reached its limit. The yellowed birth certificate fluttered from the hidden compartment behind Thomas's portrait like a leaf from an old book, its edges worn but its text still legible enough to shatter every assumption about Jack's identity. Eleanor's trembling hands held the document that would redefine their relationship and transform their understanding of the dreams that had brought them together. Born October 15, 1856, in Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory, Eleanor read in a voice barely above a whisper. Male child, name recorded as Daniel John Morrison. Mother, Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, Morrison. Father, Daniel Morrison, deceased. The silence in the study was profound, as both Eleanor and Jack processed the impossible implications of what lay before them. The document bore official seals and signatures that appeared authentic, suggesting that Jack Sullivan, Cowboy, who had ridden 300 miles following dreams of a stranger, was actually Eleanor's own son, given away at birth under circumstances that remained mysterious. Jack sank into Thomas's leather chair, his storm-grey eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Ma'am, this can't be right. I was born in a California mining camp to a woman named Mary Sullivan. My uncle told me that story my entire life." Eleanor studied the birth certificate with the careful attention of someone whose world was reshaping itself around impossible truths. The handwriting matched that of Dr. Morrison, the town's physician in the 1850s, and the official seals bore the territorial government's authentic markings. "Jack, the dates align perfectly with what I know about my own life," Eleanor said slowly. "I was indeed pregnant in 1856, though I was told the baby died during a difficult birth. Thomas was present as my friend and business partner, helping me through the crisis after Daniel's reported death. The implications cascaded through both their minds, like dominoes falling in predetermined patterns. If the birth certificate was authentic, then Jack's dreams hadn't been inherited memories of his father's love for Eleanor. They had been suppressed, childhood memories of his actual mother, awakening after 30 years of believing himself an orphan. "But my uncle, my childhood in Wyoming," Jack protested, struggling to reconcile his known history with this revolutionary revelation. Eleanor moved to Thomas's correspondence files, her business mind engaging despite her emotional turmoil. "Thomas kept meticulous records of everything. If this is true, there should be documentation of the arrangements, payments, something to explain how and why my baby was taken from me." She found what she was searching for in a locked drawer, whose key Thomas had worn around his neck. Letters between Thomas and a man named William Sullivan of Wyoming, discussing payment for services rendered and discretionary arrangements for the benefit of all parties concerned. "My God," Eleanor breathed as she read Thomas's careful correspondence. "Thomas paid your uncle to take you away and raise you under an assumed identity. He convinced me you had died, then arranged for you to disappear completely." Jack rose and began pacing the study, his military training helping him organize the shocking information into logical patterns. "That would explain why my uncle was always evasive about my parents, why he seemed to have more money than his small ranch should have provided, why he discouraged me from asking questions about my origins." The letters revealed Thomas's reasoning, a complex mixture of genuine care for Eleanor and calculated self-interest. He had believed that Eleanor could never heal from Daniel's murder if she was constantly reminded of her loss through raising Daniel's son. By removing the child, he could help her start fresh and build a new life with him. "Thomas wrote that he was protecting both of us," Eleanor said, reading from his private correspondence. "He believed you would have better opportunities, growing up away from the shadow of your father's violent death, and I would recover more completely without the daily reminder of my tragedy." Jack's expression shifted from shock to anger as he understood the full scope of Thomas's manipulation. He stole 30 years of our lives together based on his assumption that we couldn't handle the truth. He robbed you of your child and me of my mother for his convenience. Eleanor felt her own anger rising, but it was tempered by understanding of Thomas's motivations and the limited options available to a pregnant widow in 1856. The social constraints of their time had offered few alternatives for a woman facing single motherhood after her husband's murder. "The dreams," Jack said suddenly, his understanding shifting to encompass this new reality. "They weren't inherited memories from my father. They were my own suppressed memories of this house, of you awakening after decades of believing I belonged somewhere else." Eleanor examined the birth certificate again, noting details that supported its authenticity. The attending physician was Dr. Morrison, Sheriff Morrison's father. If this document is genuine, he would have kept records that we could verify. Mrs. Coulter appeared in the doorway, drawn by the intense conversation. Her expression immediately reflected recognition of some long-held secret as she observed the birth certificate in Eleanor's hands. "Mrs. Coulter," Eleanor said carefully, "you've worked in this house for 30 years. Do you know anything about what happened to my baby in 1856? The older woman's face crumpled with guilt and relief in equal measure. Ma'am, I was just a young girl then, but I remember the night you gave birth. Mr. Thomas said the baby died, but I never saw a body, never heard about burial arrangements. It struck me as strange even then. Her testimony provided crucial corroboration for what the documents suggested. Multiple people had been complicit in the deception, but time and guilt were finally revealing the truth about events that had shaped 3 lives for over 3 decades. There's more, Mrs. Coulter continued hesitantly. I've been watching Mr. Jack since he arrived, and he has your late father's hands, the same long fingers, the same way of gesturing when he talks, physical traits that can't be coincidental. Jack looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, recognizing the inherited characteristics that connected him to Eleanor's family line. The evidence was mounting from multiple sources, creating a compelling case for what had seemed impossible just minutes earlier. Eleanor approached Jack slowly, studying his features with new eyes that looked for family resemblance rather than romantic attraction. Your jawline matches my father's, and your expressions when you're thinking deeply remind me of myself at your age. The emotional complexity of their situation was overwhelming. They had connected as stepmother and stepson, developed romantic feelings appropriate to unrelated adults, and now discovered they were actually mother and son, separated by decades of deception. Jack, can you forgive me for not recognizing you, for not fighting harder to keep you when you were born? Jack's anger dissolved as he recognized the pain Eleanor had carried unknowingly for 30 years. Ma'am, mother, you were grieving your husband and dealing with pressures I can't even imagine. Thomas convinced you I was dead, and you had no reason to doubt someone you trusted. The word mother hung in the air between them, strange and wonderful after 30 years of separation. Eleanor felt her heart expand with joy, even as her mind struggled to process the complete reorganization of their relationship. Outside, the sounds of Marcus's approach reminded them that their personal revelations would have to be processed while defending against ongoing threats. But the discovery of their true relationship had transformed their alliance from friendship into something far more powerful. Mother, whatever comes next, we'll face it together, Jack said, using the word with growing comfort. I've found my family, and nobody, not Marcus, not the developers, not anyone will separate us again. Eleanor felt strength flowing through her that had nothing to do with wealth or social position, and everything to do with the primal bond between mother and child. Her son had returned to her through means that defied explanation, bringing skills and determination that would help protect everything they both valued. The truth about their relationship would need careful revelation to the community, but for now it remained their private mirror-clear reunion, 30 years in the making, accomplished through dreams that had proven stronger than deception, distance, and time itself. Eleanor's father's will emerged from its hiding place behind the false back of Thomas's safe like a sword drawn from stone, its legal language promising salvation if they could prove its authenticity before Marcus's final assault. The document, dated 3 months before her father's death, contained provisions that would completely negate Marcus's claims and secure the estate's future under Eleanor's complete control. This changes everything, Jack said, examining the will's detailed provisions by lamplight in the pre-dawn hours. Your father not only left you the estate in perpetuity, but he specifically excluded any future claims by collateral heirs or their descendants. Eleanor felt hope and urgency warring in her chest as she studied her father's careful handwriting. The will had been hidden so thoroughly that even Thomas might not have known of its existence, secured behind documents that hadn't been disturbed since her father's death 30 years earlier. Look at this clause. Eleanor pointed to a specific paragraph. The estate is to remain in my possession during my lifetime, then pass to any children I might have, regardless of legitimacy or circumstances of birth. My father was protecting against exactly the kind of family challenges Marcus is mounting. The legal implications were staggering. If the will could be authenticated and probated, it would not only defeat Marcus's current schemes, but establish Jack's legitimate inheritance rights as Eleanor's son. The document provided both immediate protection and long-term security. Mrs. Coulter entered with coffee and urgent news from town. "Ma'am, Timothy reports that Marcus has gathered quite a group for this morning's confrontation. Sheriff Morrison counted at least 12 men, including those rough characters who don't look like they're here for legal proceedings." Jack's military experience immediately assessed the threat level. 12 men suggests they're prepared for more than legal pressure. We need to ensure we have reliable witnesses and escape routes if things turn violent. Eleanor studied the will one final time before securing it in a leather portfolio. This document is our strongest weapon, but it's useless if we can't get it to Judge Patterson for official recognition. Marcus will do everything possible to prevent that from happening. Dr. Brennan arrived as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, carrying his medical bag and a grim expression. "Eleanor, I've examined the competency papers Marcus filed. They're based on sworn statements from people who claim to have witnessed erratic behavior and poor judgment on your part." "Perjured statements," Eleanor replied firmly. "I'd like to know who he convinced to lie about my mental state and what inducements he offered." "That's what concerns me," Dr. Brennan continued. "The statements come from people who should know better. Mrs. Henderson from the general store, Tom Bradley from the bank, even Reverend Walsh's predecessor, who moved to Denver last year." Jack frowned at the list of supposed witnesses. People who are either susceptible to financial pressure or too distant to be easily contradicted. Marcus has been more thorough than we realized. Sheriff Morrison arrived with Mayor Hutchins and 3 deputized townsmen, all armed and looking grimly determined. "Eleanor, we've come to escort you and Mr. Sullivan to the courthouse safely. There's talk of Marcus trying to prevent you from reaching Judge Patterson." Eleanor felt grateful for the community support that Marcus had underestimated. These men were risking their own safety to protect her rights and ensure justice prevailed over manipulation and intimidation. "Sheriff, we have evidence that could resolve this entire situation in our favor," Eleanor said, patting the leather portfolio containing her father's will. "But we need to reach Judge Patterson before Marcus can interfere with legal proceedings." The group organized their departure with military precision, Jack's experience evident in their strategic planning. Eleanor would ride in the center of their formation, protected by armed men who understood the stakes involved in their mission. As they prepared to leave, Timothy burst into the house with alarming news. "Ma'am, Marcus's men have blocked the main road to town. They're claiming authority to inspect all traffic for weapons and contraband." Jack cursed softly at this escalation. "They're trying to control access to the courthouse. We'll need an alternative route that avoids their roadblock." Sheriff Morrison knew the terrain as well as anyone in the territory. "There's an old mining trail that approaches town from the north. Rough riding, but it bypasses their position completely." Eleanor felt her determination crystallize into absolute resolve. "Then that's our route. I won't be intimidated by thugs who mistake violence for authority." Mrs. Coulter appeared with a traveling bag containing essential documents, food, and medical supplies. "Ma'am, I've packed everything you might need if this confrontation extends beyond today. And I've hidden copies of the important papers in case something happens to the originals." The older woman's foresight reflected the loyalty that had sustained Eleanor through decades of challenges. Even facing potential violence, her household staff remained committed to protecting the family they had served faithfully. Jack checked his weapons and ammunition with the thoroughness of a soldier preparing for battle. His Medal of Honor represented courage under fire, and Eleanor felt confident that he would protect her against any threat Marcus might devise. "Mother, whatever happens today, I want you to know that finding you has been worth every hardship I've endured," Jack said quietly. "Having a family to fight for gives a man purpose he can't find anywhere else." Eleanor felt tears threaten as she embraced her son, amazed by the strength that flowed from their connection. "Jack, your father would be so proud of the man you've become." Together, we'll honor both his memory and Thomas's legacy by defending what's right. The ride to town through the mining trail tested both horses and riders, but they reached the courthouse's back entrance without encountering Marcus's roadblock. Judge Patterson was already in his chambers, having been forewarned about the day's proceedings by Sheriff Morrison's early morning message. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is highly irregular," Judge Patterson said as he examined Eleanor's father's will. "If this document is authentic, it supersedes all previous probate proceedings and invalidates the current estate arrangements." Eleanor watched anxiously as the judge studied the will's provisions, seals, and signatures. "Your Honor, my father was a careful man who anticipated potential family disputes. This will represent his true intentions regarding the estate's future." Dr. Brennan provided testimony about Eleanor's mental competency, systematically demolishing each claim in Marcus's petition. "Your Honor, I've been Mrs. Whitmore's physician for 15 years. She demonstrates exceptional clarity of thought and sound judgment in all her affairs." Mayor Hutchins and Sheriff Morrison corroborated Dr. Brennan's assessment with examples of Eleanor's community leadership and business acumen. The evidence painted a picture of a woman fully capable of managing her own affairs, despite Marcus's claims to the contrary. Judge Patterson examined the authentication marks on Eleanor's father's will with a magnifying glass, comparing signatures and seals to archived court documents. "This appears genuine, but I'll need expert verification before making final determinations." Outside the courthouse, sounds of gathering crowds indicated that Marcus had arrived with his supporters. Voices carried through the windows as townspeople chose sides in the confrontation that would determine Cedar Ridge's future character. "Your Honor, if I may address the broader implications," Eleanor said, rising from her chair with dignity befitting her position. "This isn't just about my property rights. The railroad development would destroy our community's character and displace families who have lived here for generations." Jack stood beside his mother, his presence communicating strength and support without overshadowing her leadership. "Judge Patterson, the military taught me about fighting for principles worth preserving. This lady represents everything honorable about our way of life." The courthouse door burst open as Marcus entered with Pemberton and 2 lawyers, their faces flushed with anger at discovering Eleanor's early arrival. "Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore is attempting to circumvent proper legal procedures with fabricated documents. Mr. Whitmore, you will address this court with proper respect." Judge Patterson replied sternly, "I've reviewed the competency petition and find insufficient evidence to support your claims about your aunt's mental state." Marcus's composure cracked under the judge's rebuke. "Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore is being manipulated by a stranger who appeared from nowhere claiming impossible family connections." Eleanor stood and faced her nephew directly. "Marcus, the family connection isn't impossible, it's documented. Jack is my son, stolen from me as an infant through Thomas's well-intentioned but misguided protection. His birth certificate, which we've verified, establishes his legitimate inheritance rights under my father's original will." The revelation stunned everyone in the courtroom, including Marcus, who had built his schemes around Eleanor's supposed isolation and lack of direct heirs. The existence of a legitimate son, with documented birth records, completely undermined his legal strategy. Judge Patterson examined Jack's birth certificate alongside Eleanor's father's will, noting how the provisions seemed designed to protect exactly this kind of family situation. These documents, if authentic, establish clear legal succession that excludes collateral claims. Pemberton whispered urgently to Marcus, their private conference revealing the desperation of men whose elaborate plans were collapsing. The railroad development required the Whitmore estate as its centerpiece, and without it, their entire investment would prove worthless. "Your Honor, we request time to examine these alleged documents for evidence of forgery," Marcus's lawyer interjected. "Such convenient discoveries deserve scrutiny." "Granted," Judge Patterson replied, "but until expert analysis is complete, This court issues a temporary restraining order, preventing any transfers or sales of the disputed property. Eleanor felt relief wash over her as legal protection was established, but she recognized that Marcus's forces wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. The men gathered outside represented more than legal pressure. They represented the potential for violence if civilized remedies failed. Sheriff Morrison approached the bench. "Your Honor, I recommend increased security for all parties while these matters are resolved. Emotions are running high, and I've observed armed men who don't appear interested in legal outcomes." Judge Patterson nodded gravely. "Sheriff Morrison, you have authority to maintain order by whatever means necessary. These proceedings will continue under the protection of law, not the threat of force." As the morning session concluded, Eleanor and Jack prepared for whatever challenges Marcus might devise next. They had won the first battle through preparation, legal documentation, and community support. But the war for Cedar Ridge's future was far from over. "Mother, we've bought time and established our legal position," Jack observed as they prepared to leave the courthouse. "Now we need to ensure Marcus can't use intimidation to achieve what legal pressure has failed to accomplish." Eleanor felt pride in her son's strategic thinking and grateful for his protective presence. Together, they represented not just family unity, but the community values that Marcus and his corporate allies sought to destroy for profit. The final confrontation was approaching, but they would face it with law, truth, and each other advantages that no amount of money or hired muscle could overcome. The telegraph message arrived at the courthouse like a thunderbolt from heaven, carried by the operator who had ridden hard from the train station with news that would transform the entire legal battle. Judge Patterson read the urgent communication twice before looking up at the assembled parties with an expression of grim satisfaction. "This telegraph is from the Colorado Territorial Attorney General," Judge Patterson announced, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "Mr. Marcus Whitmore, you are hereby notified that warrants have been issued for your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud property owners." The courthouse erupted in shocked murmurs as the implications of the message became clear. Eleanor felt vindication surge through her as official justice finally caught up with Marcus's elaborate schemes. Marcus's face drained of color as he realized his careful plans were unraveling beyond recovery. "Your Honor, this is obviously some mistake. I demand to see the specific charges and evidence." Judge Patterson consulted the telegraph message again. "The charges stem from your activities in Denver, where you allegedly forged property documents and defrauded elderly landowners of their inheritance rights. The pattern matches exactly what you've attempted here in Cedar Ridge." Jack stepped forward, his military bearing evident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, this explains the sophisticated nature of Marcus's pressure campaign. He's been practicing these techniques on other victims before targeting my mother." Pemberton and his associates began edging toward the courthouse exit, clearly understanding that their association with Marcus had become legally dangerous. The railroad development scheme was collapsing as its local coordinator faced criminal prosecution. Sheriff Morrison moved to block the exits, his deputies positioned to prevent anyone from fleeing before the situation was fully resolved. "Nobody leaves until we sort out who's involved in what criminal activities." Eleanor rose from her chair with dignity befitting her vindication. "Your Honor, I request that this court examine all documents Marcus has presented, as I suspect they will prove to be forgeries designed to support his fraudulent claims." Judge Patterson instructed his clerk to gather all papers filed by Marcus, including the tax assessments, competency petitions, and property valuations. "Mr. Whitmore, you will remain in custody pending the arrival of territorial authorities." Marcus's desperation became evident as he realized the scope of his legal troubles. "Aunt Eleanor, surely we can resolve this as a family matter. I was only trying to help you manage complex business situations." "Marcus, you forfeited any claim to family consideration when you chose criminal fraud over honest communication," Eleanor replied firmly. "Your actions have endangered not just my property, but the entire community's future." The telegraph operator returned with additional messages that painted an even clearer picture of Marcus's criminal activities. Reports from 3 different territories described similar schemes targeting wealthy widows and elderly property owners. Your Honor, it appears Mr. Whitmore has been operating a coordinated fraud network across multiple jurisdictions. Sheriff Morrison reported after reviewing the messages. The pattern of false documents, manufactured emergencies, and pressure tactics matches perfectly. Jack examined the evidence with the analytical mind that had served him well during his military career. The sophistication suggests this wasn't Marcus acting alone. He had professional assistance in creating forged documents and coordinating pressure campaigns. Pemberton's lawyer attempted to distance his client from Marcus's criminal activities. Your Honor, the Colorado Development Company was unaware of Mr. Whitmore's background. We were operating under the assumption that his property claims were legitimate. Judge Patterson's skeptical expression suggested he found this explanation unconvincing. Mr. Pemberton, your company's aggressive tactics and coordination with Mr. Whitmore suggest deeper involvement than mere ignorance. Eleanor felt the satisfaction of watching justice prevail over manipulation and greed. The elaborate conspiracy that had threatened her independence was crumbling under the weight of Marcus's past criminal activities. Your Honor, I move that all documents presented by Marcus Whitmore be declared invalid and that his competency petition be dismissed with prejudice. Eleanor's hastily retained attorney requested. Motion granted, Judge Patterson replied without hesitation. Mrs. Whitmore, this court finds no evidence whatsoever of mental incompetency. Your judgment appears sound and your legal rights remain fully intact. The courtroom began to clear as Pemberton and his associates realized their development plans had become impossible to pursue. Without Marcus's fraudulent claims and with Eleanor's competency confirmed, they had no legal avenue for acquiring the essential property. Sheriff Morrison approached Marcus with handcuffs, the metallic sound echoing through the courthouse as justice was finally served. Marcus Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Eleanor watched her nephew's arrest with mixed emotions, satisfaction at his defeat, but sadness that family relationships had been so thoroughly corrupted by greed and dishonesty. Jack moved to stand beside his mother, offering silent support as they witnessed the conclusion of the legal battle that had threatened everything they valued. The courthouse that had seemed like hostile territory just hours earlier now felt like a sanctuary of justice. The wanted poster unfolded in Judge Patterson's hands like a map to Marcus's criminal past, revealing a trail of fraud and deception that stretched across 3 territories under multiple aliases. The document, delivered by a federal marshal who had been tracking Marcus for months, showed the true scope of his criminal enterprise. Marcus Whitmore, also known as Martin Wheeler and Michael Warren, Judge Patterson read aloud, wanted for land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud elderly property owners in Colorado, Wyoming, and Kansas territories. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition as she realized how close she had come to becoming another victim in Marcus's systematic campaign against vulnerable landowners. His targeting of her hadn't been personal family business, it had been professional criminal activity. The federal marshal, a weathered man named Harrison, approached the bench with additional evidence. Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore has defrauded at least 12 families of their property rights using techniques identical to what we've witnessed here in Cedar Ridge. Marcus's shoulders sagged as he realized the full extent of his exposure. The carefully constructed identity he had maintained in Cedar Ridge was crumbling under federal investigation that had been building for over a year. Marshal Harrison, what penalties does Mr. Whitmore face if convicted on these charges? Judge Patterson inquired. Federal prison, Your Honor. Minimum 10 years, possibly 20, depending on the total value of property involved in his schemes. Jack stepped forward to address the court. Your Honor, I'd like to ensure that Marcus's victims in other territories are notified of his arrest. Justice delayed is justice denied, especially for elderly people who may not have much time to recover their stolen property. Eleanor felt proud of her son's concern for Marcus's other victims. His military service had instilled values that extended beyond personal interests to broader concepts of justice and community welfare. Marshal Harrison nodded approvingly at Jack's suggestion. "We'll be coordinating with territorial authorities to ensure all victims can pursue civil recovery in addition to criminal prosecution." Pemberton made one final attempt to salvage his development plans. "Your Honor, regardless of Mr. Whitmore's criminal activities, the Colorado Development Company maintains legitimate interest in pursuing property acquisition through proper legal channels." "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Patterson replied sternly, "your company's association with a known criminal raises serious questions about your business practices. I suggest you pursue development opportunities elsewhere." Eleanor rose to address the court for what she hoped would be the final time in this matter. "Your Honor, I request that this court formally recognize my father's will and my son's inheritance rights, ensuring permanent protection against future fraudulent claims." Judge Patterson consulted the authenticated documents one final time. "Mrs. Whitmore, this court hereby validates your father's will and recognizes Jack Sullivan Morrison as your legitimate heir with full inheritance rights to the Whitmore estate." The legal victory was complete, Eleanor's competency confirmed, Marcus's schemes exposed as criminal fraud, and Jack's family status officially recognized. The estate that had been threatened by elaborate criminal conspiracy was now secured under the strongest possible legal protection. Marcus was led away in chains, his expensive clothing and confident demeanor replaced by the shabby appearance of a defeated criminal facing federal prosecution. The nephew who had claimed to protect Eleanor's interests was revealed as a predator who had targeted her vulnerability for criminal exploitation. "Mother, it's over," Jack said quietly as they watched Marcus's departure. "The estate is safe, your independence is confirmed, and our family is legally recognized." Eleanor felt the weight of months of pressure lifting from her shoulders like storm clouds, dispersing after a long siege. The home Thomas had built and her father had protected would remain in family hands, preserved for future generations. Sheriff Morrison approached with evident satisfaction. "Eleanor, this is the best outcome we could have hoped for. Marcus will face justice, the developers are departing, and Cedar Ridge remains the community we've worked to preserve." "Doctor," Brennan shook Jack's hand warmly. "Young man, your arrival saved not just your mother's property, but probably several other potential victims who would have fallen prey to Marcus's schemes." Mayor Hutchins expressed the community's gratitude. "Mrs. Whitmore, your courage in resisting pressure has protected all of us from unwanted development that would have destroyed our town's character." As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought her son home and exposed the threats to their community. Jack's dreams had led him to her at precisely the moment when his military skills and family connection were most needed. "Jack, your father's spirit guided you to me not just for reunion, but for protection," Eleanor observed. Daniel's love reached across 30 years to ensure his family would be safe when danger threatened. Jack's storm-gray eyes reflected the same thought. "I spent my whole life searching for purpose and belonging. Finding you gave me both, along with the chance to honor my father's memory by protecting what he would have wanted preserved." The courthouse steps filled with townspeople celebrating the victory over outside threats and criminal manipulation. Cedar Ridge would remain the community they had built together, free from corporate development that would have sacrificed local values for distant profits. Eleanor and Jack descended the courthouse steps together, mother and son united not just by blood, but by shared victory over forces that had threatened everything they valued. The estate was secure, the community was protected, and their family was whole for the first time in 30 years. The battles were over, but the future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities that neither had dared imagine. When Jack first appeared at Eleanor's gate following impossible dreams that had proven more real than anyone could have believed. The new family portrait rested on the mantelpiece where Thomas's wedding photograph had stood for 25 years. Its fresh silver frame capturing Eleanor and Jack in a moment of quiet happiness that transformed the entire character of the room. 3 months had passed since Marcus's arrest and the legal victory that secured their future. Time enough for the profound changes in their lives to settle into comfortable routines. Eleanor stood in her garden at sunrise, as had been her custom for 30 years, but now she was no longer alone. Jack worked among the roses, his strong hands gentle with the delicate blooms, as he learned the horticultural wisdom Thomas had passed to Eleanor during their marriage. The sight of her son tending plants that connected them to family history filled Eleanor with contentment she had never expected to experience. "The climbing roses are responding well to the new trellises," Jack observed, wiping soil from his hands on the work apron Mrs. Coulter had sewn for him. Thomas designed this garden with remarkable insight into how plants would mature over decades. Eleanor felt grateful for Jack's reverence toward Thomas's memory. Despite learning about the deception that had separated them, Jack understood that Thomas had acted from love rather than malice, seeking to protect both Eleanor and her infant son from painful truths he believed they couldn't handle. The estate was thriving under their joint management. Jack's military organizational skills complemented Eleanor's business acumen, creating an efficiency that had increased both productivity and profitability. The tenant farmers who had faced pressure from Marcus's associates now enjoyed renewed lease agreements and improved support from the main house. Mrs. Coulter emerged from the kitchen with breakfast news and visible satisfaction at how domestic routines had adapted to accommodate their expanded family. "Ma'am, we've received letters from 3 of Mr. Marcus's victims in Denver. They wanted to express gratitude for your son's testimony that helped recover their stolen property." Jack's involvement in Marcus's prosecution had extended beyond their local situation to helping federal authorities build cases that protected elderly landowners across multiple territories. His detailed testimony about Marcus's pressure tactics had provided crucial evidence for convictions that recovered thousands of dollars in fraudulent transactions. "Justice served is its own reward," Jack replied, echoing the values his military service had instilled. "But knowing those families recovered their homes makes the entire ordeal worthwhile." Eleanor reviewed correspondence from their attorney, confirming that all legal challenges to the estate had been resolved. Her father's will was officially recognized, Jack's inheritance rights were documented, and protective measures were in place to prevent future fraudulent claims. "The territorial legislature has passed new laws based on our experience," Eleanor reported. "Property fraud cases will now require higher standards of evidence and more rigorous verification procedures." Sheriff Morrison rode up the drive with his weekly visit, a routine that had developed as much from friendship as official duty. The lawman had become a valued advisor on security matters and a bridge between the estate and the broader community. "Eleanor, Jack, I bring good news from the capital," Sheriff Morrison announced as he dismounted. "Marcus has been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and the judge ordered full restitution to all his victims." The news provided final closure to the criminal case that had threatened their security. Marcus would spend the prime years of his life paying for his predatory behavior, while his victims recovered not just their property but their dignity. Dr. Brennan arrived for Eleanor's regular health examination, part of the careful attention to her welfare that had developed during the competency challenge. His medical opinion that she was in excellent health for her age had become legal documentation, protecting against future attempts to question her judgment. "Eleanor, your vitality has improved remarkably since Jack's arrival," Dr. Brennan observed after completing his examination. "Family connections provide healing that medicine alone cannot achieve." Eleanor felt the truth of his observation in every aspect of her daily life. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for decades had been replaced by purpose, joy, and the deep satisfaction of watching her son grow into his role as heir to family traditions and community responsibilities. Mayor Hutchins visited to discuss Jack's potential involvement in municipal affairs. The town's leaders had recognized his military experience and sound judgment as valuable assets for addressing community challenges and planning future development on their own terms. "Jack, we'd like you to consider serving on the Planning Commission," Mayor Hutchins proposed. "Your experience with large-scale operations and your commitment to preserving community values make you an ideal candidate." Jack glanced at Eleanor for her opinion before responding. "I'd be honored to serve, provided it doesn't interfere with my responsibilities to the estate and my mother." Eleanor felt pride in her son's careful consideration of obligations and his desire to contribute to the community that had welcomed him. His integration into Cedar Ridge society reflected well on both his character and the family reputation. Reverend Walsh stopped by to discuss plans for a Thanksgiving service, celebrating the community's deliverance from unwanted development. The spiritual dimension of their victory resonated with townspeople who understood that some battles require more than legal or financial weapons. "Mrs. Whitmore, your courage in resisting pressure has reminded all of us that faith and determination can overcome even sophisticated opposition," Reverend Walsh said. "Your story will inspire future generations facing similar challenges." As evening approached, Eleanor and Jack sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint Cedar Ridge in golden light that seemed to bless their peaceful community. The threat that had once seemed overwhelming was now just a memory, replaced by security, family connection, and hope for the future. "Mother, do you ever wonder what would have happened if those dreams hadn't led me here?" Jack asked, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. Eleanor considered the question while observing the town Thomas had helped build and her father had envisioned. "I think your father's love was stronger than death, time, or human deception. You would have found your way home eventually, because some connections transcend the obstacles people create." The future stretched before them, filled with possibilities they were only beginning to explore. The estate would continue to prosper under their joint stewardship, the community would grow according to values they shared, and their family bond would strengthen with each passing season. Jack's dreams had evolved from visions of the past to hopes for the future, plans for expanding the estate's agricultural operations, ideas for community improvements, and the quiet satisfaction of belonging somewhere that needed his skills and valued his presence. Eleanor no longer stood at her bedroom window each morning watching the sunrise alone. Her son was home, her estate was secure, and her community was protected from those who would sacrifice local values for distant profits. The loneliness that had defined her widowhood had been transformed into the rich contentment that comes from family, purpose, and the knowledge that love endures beyond all earthly obstacles. The stars emerged above Cedar Ridge as mother and son sat together, planning tomorrow's work and celebrating today's blessings. Dreams had brought them together, truth had set them free, and love had given them a future worth protecting for generations yet to come.